the Spanish sculptor, painter, and ceramicist, who was famous for his surrealist and his cubist style, Pablo Picasso, famously said that you must learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And this underpins my approach to public speaking training. What I want to do is equip you with the technical tools, the techniques, the methods, and the concepts that have worked for thousands of years, in order that you can apply these tools in a creative and playful and unique way that's unique to your own style and to your own voice. But in order to get to the good stuff, in order to get to the public speaking, I want to continue to layer a little bit more foundation. So this section is all going to be about rhetoric. But in order to understand why rhetoric is important, we need to look a little bit at the historical context from which we get rhetoric and from which we can learn rhetoric. The diagram in front of me here is a painting from the medieval era that depicts what I'm going to talk about in the next section. What you're looking at here is the concept of the liberal arts. You can see in the center you have philosophy on her throne, and underneath you have the servants of philosophy, Socrates and Plato. Now, around philosophy, you can see that there are 7 different sections, and each one of these sections corresponds to a different topic in the liberal arts. Now, the liberal arts is what we might call a classical education or a medieval education. This was a type of education, an approach to education, which sought to give the pupil the tools of learning. What does this mean? It means that if the liberal arts could be learned effectively, a pupil would no longer need a teacher or professor anymore if they wanted to learn or approach a different topic. Essentially, the liberal arts are the tools of learning. They correspond to the different cognitive capacities and processes that the brain naturally goes through. Now, there are 7 subjects here, and these 7 are broken up into 2 separate subsections. The first is called the Trivium, and the second is called the Quadrivium. Now, the Trivium is made up of the subjects of grammar. This is grammatica at the top. Logic, or here phrased as dialectica, and rhetoric, which is here rhetorica. So grammar, logic, and rhetoric are the subjects that make up the trivium, whereas arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy make up the 4 subjects of the quadrivium. So you have the trivium and the quadrivium taken together, you get the 7 subjects of the liberal arts. And these have been described in more recent history as the lost tools of learning. Lost because they were once very common and once more or less well known and taken as a given that if you were going to be educated, that you would be educated in the liberal arts. But tools of learning because they equip the learner, as I said, with the tools and the capacities in order for them to approach a new topic or a new subject without the need of appealing to a teacher. Now, this is going to make sense as we go along. But for convenience, I've listed the 7 subjects here again. You have the first 3 of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or general grammar, formal logic, and classical rhetoric. And then you have the following 4 of arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. Now, first of all, we're going to look at the trivium. Then the word trivium means the place where three roads meet. And we can think of this metaphorically as a place where three parts of reason, three parts or aspects or capacities of the mind come together in order to give us a view of reality, in order to help us determine what the truth is and to speak to that or to make our decisions and take actions according to the truth that we establish through our reason. And these are the three subjects that a student needs in order to equip themselves with the tools needed to make that assessment about reality itself. So general grammar, let's unpack this a little bit. General grammar could be described simply in a word as just knowledge. It's just pure knowledge. It can be looked at as simple data collection and input. It can be described as the foundations of learning. It is based on the memorizing of basic forms and ideas, and it answers the question of what. So general grammar is the study of the basic elements of language, such as words, the parts of speech, phrases, clauses, proper syntax, and so on. How do you use words to construct bigger ideas, paragraphs, concepts, using the proper grammar, okay, and proper concepts, proper context. So the trivium in this case is, as I said, more of a classical form of education, which would have started with the very basics, which is why we have such a thing today as grammar schools. And grammar schools, as you probably know, are for the younger people. Grammar is the rudiments. It's the basic building blocks or parts of our subjects. Whereas formal logic is when we take that knowledge and we take those parts and we start to establish an understanding. We start to look at how different concepts might contradict each other or might be compatible with each other. And this is the process that we call reasoning. In the trivium, it's known as formal logic. This can be summed up by the word understanding. We gain understanding through trial and error, through experimentation. This is the part of the learning process that involves processing data. So in the grammar school and the grammar stage, should I say, we're merely collecting data. We're not making judgments on that. This is the stage where we start to process that data and see how it fits together. And this very much involves critical thinking. Logic is where we use reason to discover the truth of our reality. And the questions that formal logic seeks to answer are why and how. Why are things the way they are? How does something work? How are things the way that they are? So far we've covered general grammar, which is knowledge and answers the question of what. And we've had formal logic, which is understanding and answers the question of why and how. And finally, we're going to get to know this section quite intimately. We have classical rhetoric. And this can be summed up with the word wisdom. Classical rhetoric is the output of the data after the processing has taken place, after the reasoning has taken place, after the new or novel concept has been formed. How do you express that? How do you convey that information as an output? And now you might begin to see why this is so important in terms of public speaking and public speaking training. Classical rhetoric is about expressing knowledge, information, or ideas effectively, persuasively, and to do so in such a manner that you can change other people's minds and change other people's hearts. And if you're very good at that, you can actually change the world if you're very good at using your words to be persuasive. And when we're talking of rhetoric in this sense, we're not just talking about how politicians conduct themselves. Like, the word rhetoric has kind of a negative connotation in today's society, where you might say to somebody who is making a point that it's just their rhetoric, and that's kind of a dismissive tone, or especially about a politician, or that politician and their rhetoric. And in that sense, it's seen to be um, like a political jargon or manipulative and so on. And I right now going to invite you to not think of rhetoric in that way anymore. If that's what you have done, then stop doing it from now and start to think of it in the classical sense. That's why it's classical rhetoric. And in that sense, what we're looking at here is in some sense, a scientific and technical approach to expressing oneself through the use of language, which can be written or verbal. It can be technical and scientific, the analysis that we perform here. But the beauty of rhetoric and why there's so much freedom with this topic is that when you learn the rules like a pro, you can begin to break them like an artist. And you can use these tools to really develop your own voice and develop your own flair on stage. And you can start to kind of throw the rule book away once you kind of have input these processes and these mindsets. So let's look at this again in a little bit more detail, but I'm going to give you a metaphor here. And I think a great metaphor for grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the trivium, is a computer operating system. When we look at the grammar of a computer, what we're talking about here is the operating system itself. That's the internal rules and parameters, the syntax by which the rest of the computer needs to work by and needs to operate within in order for everything else to function. So grammar provides the framework of the operating system. And then you have the processor, which would very much be the logical part. That's the part of the computer that's actually working with the data inputs and outputs. It's the part of the computer that's actually doing the calculations and the thinking, if you want to humanize it a little bit. It's the part of the computer that's thinking. It's the brain of the computer. And then rhetoric is the user interface. What do I mean? Well, rhetoric, none of this matters and none of this works unless there's a real human being sitting behind that or in front of that screen, tapping on those keys and communicating information, inputting information to the operating system and the processor. So in a sense, the user is the driver here, and the user is very much the driver when it comes to rhetoric. It's you as an individual expressing themselves through the use of verbal communication or written communication, and to what extent can you be persuasive or persuasive in communicating that information, but not even persuasive, just effective. How effective can you be at communicating meaning and complex meaning through the use of your words, whether written or spoken? So one more metaphor just to hammer home the point, why not? We can look at grammar as like the parts of an engine unassembled here on the left. And then we can look at logic as how would we put those parts together? Some parts will fit together and some parts won't. Some parts are designed to fit together. And the logic of the process of the trivium is once we have the individual parts, the bits of data, which are the engine parts, how do we fit them together logically to make sense, like a jigsaw puzzle, but a jigsaw puzzle that makes sense, okay? And then the rhetoric is not just the final engine, but it kind of is. It's kind of like the expression of the process. But what's more closer to rhetoric is the manual explaining how you did that process. So let me give one more example in the school setting, okay? You go to school, you start learning a new subject. First of all, it's very basic, it's rudimentary, it's the grammar stage of learning this subject. Then you'll be challenged with assignments. You'll have some maybe tests throughout the year to test your knowledge, to test your comprehension, to test that you have the reasoning part of your brain has also grasped the concepts. And then at the end of the process, you're going to be asked to write an exam, okay, and or to give even an oral exam where your teacher or your examiner may ask you questions specifically about that process or about that topic, and that would be the rhetorical part. So rhetoric is a topic that applies through so many parts of our lives. Rhetoric is every time we communicate with another human being, whether through spoken or written form, we are engaging in a form of rhetoric. So let's now begin to approach this topic as scientists, but also like artists. So we can learn the rules like a pro, and so we can begin to break them like artists and follow the advice of Pablo Picasso. Okay, so that's the trivium, but like we also have the quadrivium coming up in a moment. Just to hammer home these topics, and it's important that they go in this order. You have grammar, then you have logic, and then you have rhetoric. Grammar are the individual parts of information. In this case, I'm using letters as the symbol. Logic is figuring that out, working out from the chaos of the data that's not connected to each other and has no meaning and has no um, rational relationship. You find that rational relationship through the logical process, right? During the logical reasoning, you develop your form, you develop your argument, you develop the substance of your understanding. And then in the final phase, you express that through your voice or through your written word. You express it through communication, and that's rhetoric. And these three tools, once understood, can be applied to any new problem, challenge, or topic. Think about it. So for the quadrivium, it's another four topics, and not everybody would have done this in the classical times. You could think of the trivium as like the primary education and the quadrivium as the secondary education, and this would have been reserved for the very intelligent or for the academics. And there's an interesting theme that unites these two groups of topics. Take a look at the four quadrivium we have here. We have arithmetic, we have music, we have geometry, and we have astronomy. Whereas with the trivium, the three topics are unified by their relationship to letters and the spoken word, general grammar, formal logic, and classical rhetoric. It's very word focused, whereas the quadrivium is very numerical. That might not have been obvious straight away, or it may have been obvious. But you take the first topic, arithmetic, I mean, that's obvious that how that's numerical, okay? Maths, music, geometry, and astronomy. So what you have here is numbers plus time for music, numbers plus space for geometry, and numbers plus space plus time for astronomy. Just to go over that one more time. Arithmetic is numbers, geometry is the relationship of numbers and space, music is the relationship of numbers and time, and astronomy the relationship of numbers plus space plus time. And this is not what this course is about. We're only taking a very brief detour to look at the trivium here. You don't need to know what this is, but it's just interesting, and it lays a nice foundation for understanding rhetoric and the importance of rhetoric, okay? But just to leave it on this point, that I find it interesting that, and this is kind of what the quadrivium is reaching for, is this concept that all is number. And there's something profound in the realization that all is number, and these four topics of the quadrivium are all talking about number and the relationship of number and reality. So maybe that's a presentation for another day, but the main topic of this presentation, and what we're going to spend the rest of the time on, is talking about rhetoric, the ancient art of persuasion. And here's what we're going to cover in this class. First, I'm going to give you a brief history of rhetoric. I don't want to spend too much time on this because, we want to get to the good stuff, right? We want to get to the public speaking tools. We're going to define rhetoric very clearly so we have a good understanding of what it is we're doing when we are attempting to do rhetoric. And then the following items on this list are more practical tools and practical insights that you can begin to apply more or less straight away. I'm going to tell you about the 5 canons of rhetoric. Then I'm going to teach you about Aristotle's triangles, otherwise known as the 3 modes of persuasion. I'm going to give you a list of logical fallacies, and they're going to give you resources about where you can find more of those. Partly so you can identify them if you're listening to speeches or if you're watching the news or whatever, but also so you can avoid them, you avoid using them in your own speeches. And finally, probably the most important and most powerful part of these lessons that I'm going to give you about rhetoric is actually using rhetorical devices. And I have a number of rhetorical devices along with examples that I'm going to share with you so you can start to take these concepts and start doing rhetoric, start introducing these concepts and tools and techniques into your speech and into your speech development. My goal at the end of this would be that you know how to utilize the 5 canons and the 3 modes of persuasion. It's easy, don't worry. And it's my job to teach you exactly what you need to know to do that. That you would be able to identify and to avoid the use of logical fallacies, and that you would utilize rhetorical devices in the construction of your speech. Now, when you're doing the assignments along with this program, I'm going to give you a hint that this assignment for rhetoric, you're going to be asked to identify and use at least three, at least three rhetorical devices that you can introduce to your speech. And I'm telling you that at the beginning so that when we get to that section, you can already start to think about that and you can start to note down any ideas or any inspiration that comes to mind as we're going through that section. But first, let's jump into a brief, very brief history of rhetoric.